Hey HTDA and welcome back to Satisfactory. This is my bite-sized run which is aimed at those of you who want to progress through this game without every build taking weeks to complete, but still have an awesome looking factory. And so far my byte by byte hub over here is slowly taking shape, and we've now gotten to the point where we actually have a little bit of overflow of production going into the sink. We even have some steel overflow all the way in the back over there, but luckily nothing is going to waste because we have that sink over there. And we have been very intentional in terms of what we're building. As you can see, we have a lot of base materials now incoming, but we're going to need a lot more base materials on top of this. Now, this is one of those portions of the game which can get really boring because it's not really that exciting to build more concrete, more plates, more iron rods, more screws, heaven forbid, more screws. But you can really make that interesting. So that's what we're going to focus on today. We're going to make two builds for very basic products because we are going to need that in order to progress further. But we're going to try and make that a little bit more interesting. However, there's also a couple of other things we need to fix, so let's jump into it. One small note before we jump into the builds. At the end of the last episode, I noticed that my tractor tracks were kind of a mess, all running kind of separately from each other, kind of colliding potentially. So what I've done is I actually neatly realigned all the pathings such a way that we have trucks running to the mines on the right and coming back from the mines on the left. So basically they're all moving in the same direction and then they're splitting off depending on where they need to go. Of course, we do have the streams crossing here and there just because, well, you need to actually get to the right hand side. And we don't want to build massive highways or anything like that. But generally speaking, I think that this looks a lot more organized and should probably also help make sure that in the long run we don't have to fiddle around with our trucks as much as we would need to do otherwise. Anyway, enough about trucks, so let's jump to the build. Now, you won't actually need any new research for any of the two builds we're going to do today, but if you haven't done so, I really recommend that you unlock the improved melee combat now and make yourself a Xeno Basher. That'll just make your life a lot easier fighting the local fauna, as well as get you some more inventory slots, so that's always a welcome. Now we're going to make two builds today, and the second one, for YouTube reasons, is obviously going to be the second one, but the first one will be a copper build. Now we've already built a copper build before, but we're going to need a lot more resources, so we are going to utilize this second normal copper node over here. Now this is the node that's actually nicely tucked between all the areas that we have already kind of industrialized. So this kind of leaves this only node over here that we haven't used, and it's like the developers thought about that because it's going to be exactly what we need. Now you can see my iron truck, which is coming from over here, already driving up and down to our hub. So we're going to nicely tie in this facility to that. Now the first thing I'm going to do, of course, is put down some foundations in order to have a platform to build on. But I want to invite you to kind of be creative with how you set that up initially. And what I mean by that is it's really tempting to just find an open space and put down a square or rectangle block of foundations and work with that, which works perfectly fine, don't get me wrong, but it's also kind of boring at some point. So in order to make it interesting for yourself, just go with a more natural shape and kind of fit it around the landscape and work with that. And that might actually lead you to a little bit more interesting layouts. It's not maybe necessarily 100% optimal in the sense that you use the minimal amount of space to make all your facilities in, but it's definitely a lot more interesting to build like that. And of course, in my case, I had to make sure my tractor was actually able to still run down its route. Now, of course, you can always change the route, but I felt that going with this little diagonal over here might be an interesting way to build it. Maybe build the truck station over there, and then, well, we'll have to figure out how we build everything else. So let me fiddle around with that a little bit and show you my end result. And there we go. Now, I would say this facility looks anything but boring. It was actually quite fun to build as well, even though this facility is only supposed to be producing about 60 cables per minute and 100 copper wire per minute on top of that. So it's a really simple facility in terms of what it does, but because I challenged myself over here to kind of work with the terrain as well as not do a simple block formation, it turned out into a lot more interesting facility. Now, what did I do? First thing is, of course, very straightforward. I have a miner Mark II over here with 4 different smelters in order to make sure we get those copper ingots. Then, next up, we go into the kind of the guts of this facility, and you see this splitter over here, which is splitting between 2 rows of constructors. Now you might notice that this looks a little bit different than it usually does, because actually I have a small lift over here, and that's because these constructors are actually on a small platform. Now the reason for that is very simple. I ran into some issues with this little hill over here, so I needed to raise them a little bit off the ground. Now, that's not actually a problem, because I kind of like the asymmetry that we have going on over here. Now the second interesting part about this specific build is that we have the output on this side going into a lift and then going all the way over to the other side, connecting to the merger that is going to be over here anyway. And then on the side, the belt is going to be combined over here and then go all the way over here into the truck as well as the cable production. Now, simply having these belts on top of the constructors makes them look very interesting, a lot less boring than the usual facility, and well, it's actually a very compact way of building as well, because rather than making one large row of constructors, we now have 2 rows, and well, doing the same thing but just in a lot more interesting way. Speaking of interesting, for some reason all the local fauna tried to actually get into my facility. That's not what I wanted to show you though. I really like how we have this belt coming in over here, splitting off into that direction, and then having the cables being transported in here, and both of those items actually going into the same truck station. Now I have to admit, having 2 items and going into a single truck station is not without risk, because of course this means that we'll have 2 items mixing in here, which gives us very little control over what is being transported where. You can't put a sorter function on your truck stations. Maybe they will add that in the future, but for now it's not in the game. It's not going to be a problem, it just means that we'll have to think a little bit on how we handle that when we get to our hub. However, it does mean that we can only have a single truck line, so that saves a little bit on power. Doubling up on these truck stations does cost a lot of power, and that's the main reason I decided to just stick it into a single truck station over here. So in short, I think this is the one way of making your basic resources more interesting. Now let's go for a slightly larger build. Now, if you want to be really efficient, you might also want to revisit this copper facility that we've built a long time ago. Your storage units are likely going to be either full or nearly full, and there is actually an argument to be made that we might have wanted to kind of redesign this and use this towards our hub production. But like I said before, I don't really want to revisit my previous builds and redesign them. It doesn't really feel efficient. And well, there is actually a way to make sure this is still going to be useful. So you can place down a couple of smart splitters, but when you do, make sure that you do it when you have these splitters kind of gliding over your belt. If you see them moving block by block, so that's usually the case if you do it from the side, they typically won't actually connect to your belt, and that's going to give you a lot of headaches if you find out too late about that. So make sure you are in the gliding position, and then just place down your splitter. Now you're going to have to do that 3 times. Place down a sink as well, and then it should look something like this. 3 splitters with a lift attached, with a merger attached, with belts attached. Make sure these are Mark III belts so that you don't get into issues with too many stuff on these belts. And then over here I made a little platform, just 2 by 3, and placed a sink on top of that, and of course have that feed into that. Now if you align the sink properly, you'll have a nice and tidy little belt over here, and as you can see, all my excess cable production is now already going into the sink, and soon the copper plates and the wires will as well. Now this is not going to give you a huge amount of tickets or anything like that, but hey, if it's going to go into the storage or backing up, it's not going to give you any at all, so might as well do that. Now you heard me say something about screws at the beginning of this episode, and yep, it is that time of the game where we're going to have to make screws. And For anyone of you who has actually played this game for a little while, you'll know that you're going to need way more screws than you're comfortable making. And specifically, we are going to need to make 580 screws per minute on top of what we already have. And in order to do that, we're also going to have to make 215 iron rods per minute. Now, actually, that's a little bit more than we necessarily need, but we also want to make sure we have a little bit of a stockpile going on. Now, luckily, over here, fairly close to where our hub actually is, next to this like mountain, cliff, whatever you want to call it, we have not one, not two, we actually have 3 normal iron nodes. And actually, I really like how that creature is standing up in there. I'm gonna go kill it in a minute, but it's quite poetic. It's doing like Lion King over there. Anyway, sorry, getting distracted there. What we want to do is we are going to build a iron rod and screw facility. But instead of building it here, where it's going to get kind of in the way, we are going to build it in a more interesting place, namely on top of that cliff. Now that does mean that we are going to have to work a little bit with lifts, and I actually think I'm going to use this Lion King cliff over there to actually drop our items down below and make sure we can transport them once again. Alternatively, you can also just use this natural slope over here and bring the resources from the back. But what fun is that when you can go all Lion King? Now, of course, we do need to take into account that we have kind of this natural highway over here. There's actually also a nice slope up here. There's this highway kind of runs through here to here as well. So if we are ever going to be building trains here, I'm not entirely sure that we will be, but if we want to build trains anywhere close to here, this is probably a very natural way to do that. So that's why I also don't want to have a huge facility over here blocking like this whole intersection over here. So let's get up there, let's put some mines in place, and let's start thinking about how we can make that look a little bit more interesting than average. Okay, so we're up here, and it's kind of nice to have a look around to see how we're going to plan this out. So we have the iron nodes on the side of the cliff over here. You can't see them, they're straight down below over there. And then we have that Lion King cliff over there on the left. Now, if you're in the same location as I am currently, and you're wondering where the alien sounds are coming from, there's actually a cave. If you jump down here at the cliff, basically down there, there's going to be a cave, very easy to spot with some blue mushrooms next to it. And there's one of those items all the way in the back. Be warned, there are spiders in there, so bring a weapon. There's only a couple of them, but still. This is actually a very good location to build pretty much any factory, because there's no nodes in the way, it's fairly flat. There's only some trees that you can easily remove. So pretty much you can build here in whatever way you want, but I'm just gonna go place down some foundations and see if we can make it a little bit more interesting than just another box. So maybe something like this. Now you could go vertical very easily, and that's interesting in its own way. But I do like keeping the aesthetics of my facilities per zone kind of similar. So right now we have kind of these open spaced factories. And well, I'd like to stick with that theme at least for the next few builds, because we are still in this starting zone. So it just makes sure everything looks kind of the same, makes it feel more natural when you're walking around, rather than having completely different designs all over the place looking very artificial. And I realize that everything looks artificial when it's man-made, but I guess you get the point. So what did I do? Well, I made a couple of different platforms, and of course we do want to stay organized, so there are like sort of square-ish platforms, but I also took advantage of the height difference on the actual hill itself, so I tried to keep everything fairly low to the floor, and as a result of that you see this kind of like, well, natural hill existing even within the building. Now you see here and there is still a little bit of hill sticking through. We're going to solve that with the ramps, because we want this to be easy to navigate. But of course, that makes the most sense to do once we actually know where everything is going to be. The reason that we have these units over here is because I'd like to use this Lion King cliff, like I said before, to actually export all my stuff. That might actually be a challenge, because I just realized we're going to need 4 belts going out. But we'll solve that when we get to it. I think overall this should make for a pretty interesting build. So in order not to waste too much of your time, I'm just going to place down a huge amount of that build, and you can kind of see where I went, because this is not supposed to be a step-by-step guide on how to actually build this, just to give you a little bit of inspiration on how you can make these fairly simple early basic builds a little bit more interesting to build, but also look very nice. Now, to give you a quick insight into my design process though, the way I was thinking is we're going to get the iron from over here, so let's just build the smelters where we get up. We are going to need 12 of those, so 4 blocks of 4, well, not 4 blocks of 4, 3 blocks of 4 should actually do it, but I intentionally did not face them in the same direction. So we have a block of 8 going into a central line, and then we have a block of 4 going into a separate line. It's also because of the ratios between the belts. We also have a whole lot of iron rod productions. We actually need 24 of those, so in this case I did go for the slightly more boring setup of having 4 blocks of 8. 3 blocks of 8, I can't count today, I'm sorry. And on top of that, then we have the screw production, which is over here, which I align in 3 rows of 4. Actually 4 rows of 5. I really can't count today. Anyway, we're going to need 15 of those, actually 14 and a half, but that will do. So they're all basically on their own level, which makes it a little bit more interesting to look at them. It's simple, all flat and square, but if we put in the belts, it should look even more interesting. One thing to note is actually that, and that's the reason I actually jumped down initially, is that I once again made use of that tiny little lift setup that we also used in the previous build, just to kind of make use of the small elevation difference, and also just make it a little bit more interesting once again than just a splitter going 2 ways. So what happens if you take some creativity, you take some belts and some power, you get something like this. So I'll walk you quickly through it. We have these 2 miners combined into a single belt, going all the way up, and then bringing all those resources up there where they're actually needed. Now similarly, we have another Mark II miner doing the same with a single belt, so that means that we now have 2 incoming belts of resources, one with 240 iron ore per minute and one with 120 iron ore per minute. That ore then feeds into 2 groups of smelters. The first group is actually the larger group, is this one with the height difference that we've mentioned before, and then the second group are these 4 over here that are fed separately from the second belt with the 120 iron ore. Now we're actually feeding in these 2 rows of smelters into a single output belt, so that's where some of the creativity comes in. So we're feeding them over here, these 2 lines, but we're combining them elsewhere. Then this is basically the main line of iron ingots that's going to go into the constructors in these 2 constructor groups over here, so the 16 that we have there in the back, and then the last group of output is going to go in the 8 constructors making rods in the back over there. Now we're going to need a total of 360 iron rod per minute in terms of total throughput, and 580 screws per minute. That will take full advantage of the 360 iron ore per minute that we have in terms of resources. We don't actually need the entire production amounts that I just mentioned, so 580 screws and 360 iron rods. But the reason that we're making a little bit more than what we actually need is twofold. Well, first of all, it actually uses the resources that we have available, and second of all, we're going to need some overflow anyway, because we do want to make sure we can basically always count on having some stockpile in case we need it for building, and we're going to need it for building, and we don't want to run back to our initial start of the factory where we did have some iron plate production but not a lot, or an iron rod production, etc. What else? So we are feeding these 8 constructors as well as 2 more constructors into the screws, so we need about 9.5 constructors making rods going into the screws, so the other 2/3 approximately goes into the direct output. That means that these 2 constructors are feeding into this input belt as well, And then we have a smart splitter making sure that the overflow, because we only need 9.5 constructors going into the screw production, is being put out again over here. Now it's not completely set up correctly like I'm noticing right now, but just make sure that you use a overflow smart splitter to do so. Then of course the remaining rod production is simply combined into a single belt. It will fit on a single belt because it's only going to be 215 left, and that is going to go into an output belt, which is this output belt. And as you can see, it's a very nice amount of production, but we also need some screw production, and this is the part of this build that I really like. We have those 3 rows of screw constructors, which actually need to feed into 3 different belts because we have such a high amount of production. And as you can see, the way I actually decided to solve that is by simply making them in separate belts and combining them all the way at the end. So I'll show you in a moment in 4 different levels of belts. Now this looks really awesome when you look at it from a distance, because we have all that output being very organized and neatly organized, I would say, being fed into 4 different output belts. And then at the end, the output belts are going to go over here, and they are split off into 2 different trucks. You do that by simply building a platform in the place where you want the belts to go. Then you build the actual belt, and then when you're done, you, hopefully without killing yourself, remove the platform. And voila, suddenly you have a perfect belt suspended in the air. So it's not that hard, it just needs a little bit of thought given and some fiddling around with getting the actual lifts on the correct level. That's, to be honest, the hardest part, but the way to do that is actually just stand on the platform, connect a lift to whatever you need to collect down below. Let's say that's this, and then it's very easy to get them on the correct heights just from the platform itself. If you do it from below, it's almost impossible to get it right the first time, and it might take you like 5 or 6 tries. Really annoying, so just do that from above, but that just means you have to place the lower facility first. And speaking of trucks, that does mean that we need 2 different truck stations, unlike the previous build, because we have such a high amount of production. Basically, it's almost 4 belts worth of construction, that we really do not want to have to fiddle around with that at our hub in order to actually split that back out. I'm really hoping you are not going to clip through my lifts. Nope, that actually went completely like I intended. Nope. But at least it's not clipping through there. That's very nice. Before you start typing in the comments, I know I said we have 580 screws per minute, and the smart people among you, which is pretty much everyone I assume, will have noticed that a truck station only has 2 input ports, which means that we can only fit in 2 Mark III belts, which is a total of 540 production. So that means that we have 40 screws per minute not being able to be input in this truck station. I realized that's not going to happen, so initially we'll waste a little bit of screw production, but that's going to be very easy to fix once we get access to the Mark IV belts, and then the only thing we have to do is upgrade this little piece of belt, and then we'll have access to the full 40 extra screws, in case we need it. That's a lot easier to upgrade than having to go through an entire facility just because you didn't take that 40 into account, and upgrading this little piece of belt should be fairly straightforward. Which brings us to the end of this build. If you're still here, I would very much like your feedback on how you, well, first of all, how you like this build in particular, this style of building, and the way I'm setting up these videos, because I realize I'm not showing you all the details of building this specific build. It's not really to be intended to be kind of a step-by-step how do you build this specific build. It's more to kind of inspire you to take this idea and then just make your own build. But I'm very much interested to see what you guys think of that. I should also note that these 2 builds together took me about 4 hours to build, which is a little bit longer than the previous builds, but the theme of these builds is sort of the same, so I wanted to combine them together. I do recommend that you don't actually build the truck stations at the hub until the next episode, but if you're splitting this these two builds for yourself over maybe 2 or 3 evenings, then you might be able to combine the next episode with setting up the last parts of this build, because the next build is probably going to take you a little less time, or at least it's easier to kind of combine with setting up the truck station. So that's just a little tip. Make sure you catch the next episode as well, because it will very much tie into what we've been doing in this episode, and actually the previous episode as well. Last but not least, if you're still here, you're awesome. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so, and if you leave a comment, even if it's just feedback, and even if it's just to say hi, it's very much appreciated, always helps me out, and I hope to catch you in the next one.